Welcome, everybody. Welcome to TASA. This is a special webinar today, and I'd like to introduce Fran Collyer, a long-standing TASA member, and Graham Crowe from the United Kingdom, and I'll go into that shortly. But before I do, I'd just like to pay my respect. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today I'm talking to you from Gimoy, Yalabara, Udingi country in North Queensland, in Cairns. And look, it is a bit cool up here. It's only about 24 degrees, but I know all my friends and family in Melbourne are really struggling. So stay warm, everybody. So good morning, good afternoon and good evening to you, wherever you are listening to us from. I would like to introduce Professor Fran Collyer, currently at the University of, Professor of Sociology, University of Karlstad in Sweden, and also adjunct to University of Sydney. And I would also like to introduce Professor Graham Crowe, Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Methodology at the University of Edinburgh. And Graham just was telling us that he's in his first year of retirement. So today we have a presentation. First of all, Fran will begin the presentation and then Graham will take over. And as usual, we should have hopefully plenty of time, roughly 20 minutes or so for a discussion. We don't have to finish the conversation on the hour. We'll see how we go. We will go a little bit further, but I imagine people have got other commitments as well, so we'll just see how we go. This is being recorded, so it will be available on TASA's YouTube channel within about 24 hours, and Sally will send out an email to that effect that it's available. So first of all, yes, welcome to Fran Collyer. Thank you, Fran.
Well, hello everyone, and it's really nice to be talking to Australian sociologists again. It's been a bit of a while. Bit of a disruption to my life coming over here to Sweden, but very glad I made the change and really enjoying myself over here. For those of you who are on my Facebook pages, you will have seen me dancing away to at the Sociology staff party here in Karlstad. They're an interesting, cute crew, and the Swedes really know how to party. So, but today, okay, let's see if I can get my slides up. Okay, so I've been digging through the archives to find some nice pictures to illustrate the presentation. So hopefully we'll give a little bit of a history, a little bit of a walking back through time for those of you who were there in the 60s and 70s or 80s, and maybe something new for those who weren't. So if we can go to the next slide, Sally. Okay, so basically that's just saying what we're doing here today. So next slide. I draw a lot of the material from the ARC project that I was involved with, knowledge making in Australian society. And so I have about 197 interviews to draw on. Some of those come from the archives. For instance, the ones of Peter Elkin and Jerzy Zabritsky come from the archives. So thankfully, other people were able to interview those people before they passed on. Others I did, the interviews I did during the biggest study. Next slide. But what I want to do today is to just look at basically, I want to look at the activism, the public sociology that was done in those early years. And there were some really interesting themes that are starting to emerge from the data, which I'm doing at the moment, all the analysis of that. Lots of excitement came through all the interviews, people talking about the 60s, 70s and 80s. A lot of those people were new migrants to the country. They hadn't been in Australia before. For many of them, it was their first academic position. So lots of excitement about being in a new place and building a new university department, something that hadn't existed before. So it's a very exciting time for most people. They also talk about some really rewarding interactions between academia and government at that time. And there does seem to be something quite special about that close interaction of that period. There were lots of mature students at that time, and the students were full-time students, and a lot of us have noticed how different it is for students today. There was also, people talk about gender inequity during that time, but that's mostly the women who talk about that. The men don't seem to reflect on that anywhere near as much. There were very sharp contrasts between patches of conservatism and patches of radicalism at that time, depending on which university you were at and which period you were in. So the 60s were less radical in the early 60s than the later 60s, for instance. So there's, it's not the same for everyone. Not everyone's experiencing the same level of conservatism or radicalism. There was a lot of difficulty in sourcing Australian material at that time, so a lot of reliance on overseas material and lots of really interesting and intellectual discussions with their colleagues, which often turned into quite ferocious disputes in some of the departments. So if we go to the next slide. And so today I'm just going to look at a little bit of the public sociology that was done, which is actually quite hard to find out about, because given that our universities aren't interested in the public sociology that we've done, academics tend to just put forward on their CVs the academic publications and presentations that they've been involved with. So a lot of people don't record all those wonderful reports or newspaper articles or TV appearances that they've had, which is a real shame. But so it's been quite difficult to dig up, but I've been doing my best. So if we can move to the next slide. So this is just a little first slide before we get to the main focus of the 60s. So 1930s and 40s, we've got Peter Elkin, an anthropologist at the University of Sydney, but often claimed by sociologists as one of our own, and a fervent campaigner for the rights of Aboriginal people. He was an advisor to John McEwen, Minister for the Interior in 1939, and so important in the organisation of that new Department of Native Affairs that was being built at the time. And he was a regular public speaker. He taught at the Workers' Educational Association, WEA, which is where most of our early sociology was taught during those years before we had departments of sociology. And he produced a huge number of pamphlets on Aboriginal people, because, as he said, in the 1930s, people didn't know anything about them. They just did not know. People in particularly the bigger cities didn't know anything about the Aboriginal people. And so he set out to try and educate the Australian population about that, and claims that he, along with a lot of other people were able to make some really important changes for Aboriginal people during those early years. We move to the next slide. We move on to the 50s and 60s, and here you can start seeing some photos from the archives appearing there. Jerzy Zubrzycki, very important to all of us, often seen as the founder of multiculturalism of Australia, but we really have to share that, I think, with Jean Martin, who we'll talk about in a minute. Jerzy Zubrzycki, so an immigrant from Poland and appointed in 1955 as the second chair of sociology in Australia. And it's really quite disputed who's the first, who's the second, who's the third, and so on. Depends on whose history, who is writing that history. But either way, he was a prolific campaigner for the rights of non-British migrants. And he was on television and radio all the time. He had regular spots each day and each week, talking about migrants and talking about their services. And he reminds us that at that time, the ABS didn't have any capacity to do big surveys, had no information about migrant services, for example, their needs. And so they relied on the academics. Somebody's not muted. He relied particularly on the academics at the ANU. The government relied on academics at the ANU for providing information about the Australian population as a whole, let alone migrants or Aboriginal people, because no other department really government department had any capacity to provide that kind of information. So if we move on to the next slide, and we move into the 60s and 70s, and of course Zubrzycki was still working away and doing so much public sociology. He was given full access to the Department of Immigration files at that time through his personal friend, Peter Hayden, who was also the secretary of the department at that time. And Zubrzycki put his first report forward in 1968, arguing that assimilation was no longer working. So Peter Elkin had put forward the idea that assimilation was the way to go. By 1968, Zubrzycki was saying it's just not working and we need cultural pluralism. He says the report went down like a lead balloon. So he was talking to 1,200 people at the Australian Citizenship Convention and all the press, the media and so on. But the reception of that was not good. It was completely hostile. He'd had a go at the education ministers of the time, who were all there from all around the country, and he lambasted them for the way they were treating non-British migrants. They were putting non-British migrants in with intellectually disabled students because they didn't have the languages, and Zubrzycki saw this as a really dreadful way of treating these migrants. Anyway, lots of other public sociology there for Zubrzycki. He was on the Australian Immigration Advisory Council for years, I believe about 10 years, but I'll have to check those dates, maybe even longer than that, working alongside people such as Bob Hawke, Al Grasby, and many others. Bob Hawke, of course, at that time was president of the ACTU, and was very instrumental in apparently in bringing those Vietnamese migrants to Australia in 1977. So lots of public sociology from Zubrzycki. If we move to the next slide. 60s and 70s, Jean Martin, Foundation Professor of Sociology at La Trobe in 65, and of course our first female Professor of Sociology in this country. In 64, Martin worked on the Henderson Report, and which was going to be a report written by economists, but Martin managed to help them redesign that and make it much more sociological. That became really important over the years. 72, she was a member of the McMahon Government Commission of Inquiry into Poverty. Lots of committees that Jean Martin was on. I'm really only mentioning a tiny number of them here, just trying to highlight them for you. She was on the Whitlam's Schools Commission, on the Committee on Social Change and the Education of Women, along with some other very important women from our history. Whitlam's School Commission was very important. It appears in so many of the interviews of that period. It was a very important commission. It gave us sociologists a mechanism for doing lots of really good public sociology. 1977, she's on the Committee of Social Patterns, co-producing with Zabriskie a report, Australia as a Multicultural Society. So this report was the first time for multiculturalism to be defined, to be given this new name, and to set out a policy agenda. It was a complete flop, says Zabriskie. Well, it might have been at that time, but very soon afterwards, we start to see some multicultural policies being introduced over the years. So it might not have been received well by the powers that be on the day, but it certainly worked in the longer term. Okay, if we move to the next slide, and this is the 70s and 80s again. So much public sociology being done. I can only mention a tiny few of them here. People like Eva Cox, Andrew Jakubowicz, and Wendy Bacon, all young, early career PhD students at that time, doing some really interesting work on urban development, the Green Bands with Jack Mundy and his BLF, his Builders Labourers Federation, promising that any developer who tore down the historic sites in Sydney would never find themselves a tradesperson or a builder's labourer to work on their sites, so leave those sites alone. So these people, these sociologists and others, were trying to protect these historic, not just the physical environment of Sydney, which is so important and which luckily we still have some of that today, but also the social infrastructure of Sydney, where there were communities that were being destroyed by this raging development of the period. All these people went on to do much more public sociology over their lifetime. Jakubowicz, a board member of the Illawarra Community Legal Service and the Migrant Resource Centre, very important, on the board of the SBS, the Special Broadcasting Service, went on over the years to do so much work with ABC and SBS television, producing lots of documentaries and so on. He's a figure that is well worth looking up and looking at some of the activism, so much activism from Andrew over the years. Okay, and the next slide, which is my last one. And again, only a tiny little look at a few of the really important bits of public sociology that was done during these years. Frank Jones. Now, Frank is often overlooked. for all the work he's done. He's well known for his work at ANU on occupational mobility and so on, but his public sociology was huge as well. Again, really important, providing information and knowledge about Aboriginal affairs. Working with the National Capital Development Commission. Canberra at that time is still very much a sheep paddock, and the whole city needed to be developed, and he was important in assisting with that process. Lots of labour market research and migrant and multicultural research as well. Anna Yateman, known for her academic sociology, of course, at Flinders, at Waikato, at Macquarie, but she also did lots of public sociology. Her reviews of children's services, of domiciliary care, multicultural affairs, and so on. Important work that she did there, not just with South Australian, but federally as well. Lois Bryson, again, lots of really great work with the National Foundation for Australian Women, the Electoral Lobby, and so on. Looking at sexual assault in the Defence Force, being an advisor to so many committees and on lots of boards, and probably best known for her project on women's health, where she had hundreds, 57,000, I think it is, Australian women enrolled in this women's longitudinal health study, which is still going and going well. And Raewyn Connell, who none of us would be able to forget, of course. Lots and lots of public sociology. I only mention a few little things here. Her work with Gary Dowsett, Sue Kippak, on Baxter and others, on AIDS and gay men's health. Her work with the Schools Commission, again, on disadvantaged schools program, and her work with the Premier's Department on a gender equity project with Tony Schofield. So just really a tiny little look at the history of some Australian public sociology that's being done. And the next slide is just some acknowledgements, I think, yes. So just where I got my information from, and the acknowledgement of the help of others in doing this work. So I might leave it there. And
Bruce, yes.
Hiya, hiya, Fran. How's it going?
Good, thank you.
I'm here in New Zealand. I was kind of wondering if I've done a very slightly similar piece of research, much more shallow than what you've done in the New Zealand context, and it seemed to me that the main factor about perhaps a retreat from a public sociology in New Zealand academia was the election of a Labour neoliberal government in the 1984 in New Zealand. And from that stage onwards, there was famously only one sociologist that ever got any work around neoliberal policies, and all the other sociologists were cast into the utter darkness in terms of doing any government funding research for quite a long period of time. Is there any similar relationship there? I mean, was sociology naturally Labour leaning, so that when Labour was in power, there was more work for them, or would you not pick that up?
Yes, I would. Certainly in more recent years, it's left and right, conservative and left wing. Early days, it didn't matter. I mean, Zabritsky worked for all those different governments, and a lot of the work of public sociology in those early years, so 30s through to 70s, was done with conservative governments. But more recently it's left and right. But there were a few other changes that need to be mentioned. It's certainly to do with the way in which neoliberalism comes in. It comes in into the core departments first, and then it comes into the other departments, the social services, education, and so on. But neoliberalism comes into the finance department and so on first. And as it comes in, you get, from the Howard era particularly onwards, you get sociologists no longer being seen as experts and independent experts, but as interested and left-wing and critical. So you get a shift in the government in the way they see these academics. But at the same time, you see work intensification in the universities. So the academics are no longer able to spend as much time doing public sociology. That's really important. And another one is as a result of those two things, you get those old industry university bodies like Uni Advice, Uni Search, that used to manage the consultancies for the universities and get the academics involved in these different consultancies. You get those disappearing. They're no longer able to get the academics to work because of work intensification, and you get it being done by big commercial firms like Cooper's Lybrand.
Yep. KPMG.
So that's another shift.
Well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Joanna has a question, and then Ricky Spencer. Go ahead, Joanna.
Yes, thank you. Just had to unmute. Thank you. So nice to hear you, Fran. Congratulations on your position. It's very good news. Well, I'm really asking about if there was any visible relationship between the public-facing work that people were doing and the publications that were being done in the more academic role.
Certainly, people were working on reviews and consultancies, and also at the same time the same research area. So if their issue was migrant health,
yeah,
absolutely, okay. That's yes.
Okay.
Very much so, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so we were going to have one more question, but what I might do is, if we don't mind, is to move on to Graham Crowe. So Graham Crowe is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Methodology at the University of Edinburgh, and his talk, his paper today is about academic legacies, so sociological lives then and now. So thank you, Graham.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and also I've already had some interesting discussions with Fran, and although what I'm going to talk about is not the same as what she's done, we've already had some interesting kind of conversations about how there are connections here. So what I've been doing is get it to go to the next slide. I've got some funding from Leverhulme to look at later academic careers and retirement of UK-based academics, and I was interested in a range of issues, but the one I think that's most relevant today is about the way in which academics sometimes find it quite difficult to handle the process of later career and retirement, and in particular wanted to draw out some findings about continuing legacies, which I think is kind of one aspect of what Fran has been talking about there. So I'm going to just run through some of my findings, which are from a study that was a survey, some interviews. I also looked at some obituaries as well, and also looked at some university staffing policies. But I've got some things on my website if people want to follow some of those things up. But I've got three broad findings. One of which is that academics tend not to retire completely, and even when they are retired, which I'm defining as getting most or all of their income from pensions, that they continue to do academic work on the whole, that the decision about when to retire is going to be influenced to some extent by concern about securing a legacy and or reputation, but that's not universal. And I've got some data about how people feel that universities now are not the same institutions as the ones that they that they were in when they were earlier career. So just very briefly, there was a combination, as I say, of survey and interview data, and broadly, so this is not just sociologists, these are people working in all disciplines in UK universities, and I had more people from STEM subjects in the survey and more arts, humanities and social science in the interviews, despite my best efforts to try and get a broader range in each of those. And very broadly, there were 2/3 of the participants were men and 1/3 women. So my first finding that I want to report is that academics don't really retire, or at least most academics don't really retire fully. So if we take the definition of retirement as getting most or all of your income from pension, then it was only a minority of the retired survey participants who agreed that retirement should be a time for making a clean break and a fresh start from work and doing something completely different. And that was also the view of people who hadn't yet retired. So the idea of an academic career coming to an end and then people doing something completely different is very definitely a minority point of view. And nearly half of my survey participants were still in some sort of paid relationship with their universities after they retired, and nearly 3/4 were still engaged in academic work, either teaching or research, and either paid or unpaid. And I did interview someone who at one extreme was in their 80s and still working full time, and in the UK you have to start taking your pension age 75, so it was clearly not doing it for the money. But when I pressed them about whether they had retirement on their horizon at some point, they just said, well, what else would I do? So some people never retire and don't leave their jobs, continue to work full time well into their 80s. By contrast, at the other end of the scale, there was someone I interviewed who recalled a former colleague of theirs who on the day that he retired said, I'm never going to think another academic thought. So that was an example of a clean break, which was inspiring to this interviewee, who was actually quite glad after 4 decades to have left higher education. So those are the two extremes. But for most people, they're falling somewhere in between these two ends of the spectrum. And even after formally retiring, it's an important part of many people's identity, and that people don't want to have a sudden change at the point of retirement. And some people say, well, I don't even think of myself as retired. That's not a word I'd use about myself. And someone else said, when I asked him, that he described himself as paid by the pension fund. He was still doing research, also well into his 70s. And then the second point, which I think ties in with some of Fran's findings, interestingly, about what motivates people in their careers and the way in which they handle later careers and retirement. And a theme of more than one survey participant was that they wanted to secure their legacy. They maybe had built up a research center, or maybe had some group of colleagues they were working with, and used a transition period to secure their legacy by making sure that the work they were interested in carried on. And I dare say that ties in with some of what Fran was saying about people who've been working in public sociology type tasks. They don't want it all to come to a stop just because they themselves individually are retiring. So relinquishing roles and handing them over is an important motivation. And there's also legacy in the sense of reputation, and an awareness that people who do try to go on and on and on can sometimes feel or can sometimes discover that, that there is a point at which their colleagues are expecting them to go. So they're giving this advice about approaching retirement, that it's better to go when people are sorry to see you go, rather than saying, at last they're going. And I had a similar theme coming through from the interviews, and what came out there was a good example of that was this interviewee who recalled speaking to a colleague who had said that he was retiring at 65 because he dreaded being regarded by the students as that old geezers who's always hanging about the place. And other interviewees feared a similar kind of judgment being made on them by younger colleagues as well as by students, because they're no longer at the center of things. One of the things that surprised me was I asked people whether they could identify role models of successful academic retirement, and surprisingly few people actually came up with a name. I mean, some people said, I don't think in terms of role models at all, but even those who did say that they might do couldn't really identify good examples. So it was with some relief when actually a few individuals were identified. And one of them that I guess colleagues in Australia will have heard of, who was identified, was Stuart Hall. And the interviewee here says that he was a role model for him because he managed to keep going in his fields beyond the point of leaving, in Stuart Hall's case, the Open University, and in fact returning to long-standing interests which Stuart Hall had had at the start of his career in relation to art and literature, even though he had, in his working part of his, or the later working part of his life, had been focusing more on politics and social theory. And so he was regarded as a role model. I had one or two other role models as well identified, but broadly, I was surprised at how few people were identified as role models for others to kind of take their lead from. But I don't want to suggest that it's all a rosy story. And some people in talking about later careers and retirement were very disillusioned. And the same interview, in fact, who was a rich source of material when we came to this question, said about audit culture. If I was to summarize my last decade, so this person had retired a few years ago, if I was to summarize my last decade of working in higher education, it was always the feeling of never being good enough. That was what the job left me with. I was never good enough. I was never publishing enough. I was never teaching enough. I was never doing enough admin. I was never doing it properly. I was never excellent enough. And insensitive interviewer that I am, I thought I'd maybe just suggest that maybe he could add to that list, never bringing enough money, as if he wasn't feeling bad enough already. And he said, no, I just got tired of it in the end, this multiplying sense of your own inadequacy. So for some people, it is a difficult transition. And indeed, there were lots of reasons why people said that they felt that their institutions had changed, left them feeling overworked and undervalued, that academic standards had changed. Interestingly, I don't recall anybody talking about what Fran was talking about just then, about having less time to engage in kind of wider activities like public sociology and in other disciplines too. But interviewee 39, who I just mentioned in the previous slide as well, gave the memorable image of feeling like he'd been thrown overboard, and that the institution was like a liner going off into the distance in the ocean, and you're just left there with the lifebelt. So there were some themes that came through from people who were sort of less happy with the process about feeling forgotten. And I was reminded there about the famous question, who now reads Herbert Spencer? And then I put in this slide as well because I thought it was interesting for the way in which this participant had talked about reaching a tipping point. So this is someone who looked at being an academic as made up of a variety of different elements, and came to a judgment that the balance between the parts that she really loved, the parts that she felt she was competent at and it was fine to do, and then the elements that she described as the shit bit, and that the work was increasingly dominated by the work that she didn't enjoy. So she reached a point at which she thought she would just call it a day and take her pension. But she knows as well that she's lucky to have that choice because here in the UK, I guess, as some of you will know, there's an ongoing dispute about pension changes, and the arrangements for pensions for younger generations in UK universities are not as generous as they are for this person who by this time was in her 70s. So just some broad conclusions. The first one is that retirement is broadly associated with contentment, and most of my study participants had retired by their later 60s, some beforehand, and most considered that they had retired at the right time. The law was changed in 2012, I think it was, in the UK, so that there was no longer a fixed retirement age for most universities. There are one or two that have negotiated a special arrangement whereby they can make people retire, but on the whole, people can go on in employment for as long as they wish, as long as they continue to perform according to the various requirements of the post. But most felt that they had retired at the right time and didn't feel that they'd missed out by not staying longer in the post. And as I say, that's connected very much with being quite comfortable economically. And as I say, that may change as time goes on. But broadly, people were happy to be retired. It was a very small part of the study who were unhappy about being retired relative to their working life, partly because, of course, they were able to continue with the that they found, or something that they found rewarding. And then the second conclusion is that there is a spectrum of trajectories here. So I mentioned that there are these extreme positions on the spectrum of people who make an absolute clean break, the person who has his final academic thought and never engages with academia ever again on retirement, and those people who never retire. Most people are in the middle, and it's possible in the UK to be a continuing scholar, sometimes paid, unpaid, just for the love of it. And Ebau's study of becoming an X, I drew on in making sense of this, because what she suggested is absolutely confirmed by my data about how exiting from the role of being paid academic is more difficult for people who have no idea what they're going to do afterwards. And then I've got my point there that I was surprised that there were very few kind of celebrated role models of academic retirement, and those that were identified were people that were known that were known personally. And then my final point is one that I'll just mention. I did, as part of the study, look at university human resources policies about retirement, and they were very surprisingly frank, some of them, about how they could be supportive, but also they could be quite demanding. And one in particular, which has now disappeared from this university's website. I don't know whether I've had any hand in that by doing talks like this, but one said, just because you're getting older doesn't mean to say that we're not going to assess you with as much rigor as any other working group, and we're aware that people do slow down. So some universities are better to work with in later career and in retirement than others. And then, like Fran, I've just put a few references here, and I realize I should as well have put some thanks there to the Trust for funding this research. So I now need to stop sharing, don't I? Oh, could you help me with? Oh, you've managed to do that for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Graham. Thank you, Graham, and thank you, Fran. And we have some questions. First, Ricky Spencer wanted to talk about the usefulness of this for VCE sociology. So go ahead, Ricky.
Okay, well, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you both speakers. I feel so privileged to hear what you say, and I feel very inspired to keep going on my journey at 53 as I'm sort of in the early stages of everything. One thing is I'm now privileged enough to be on the board committee to rewrite VCE sociology, and I'm very passionate about what Fran has said, and I think this is something for many years I wanted to give young people the opportunity to see how it's so important and why it's so important to study sociology and how you can make an impact in governance. So Fran, big kisses and big stars for me, because I'm going to be following up from you if that's okay, and I would love to include your work in the new VCE sociology. And also, Malcolm, I love this because this is what young people need to see, the relevance of older people. You know, I plan to work till I'm in my 90s, whether it's paid or unpaid. For me, it's having a contribution to society. And I think that the message I'm getting from you is that, you know, we've got to have some value more to our people, that once you get to a certain age, but just being a little bit political here, you know what, let's revamp sociology at universities. All these cutbacks and that we've got to work with, we've got to reposition sociology as a core discipline that students need to study, that it's, oh my God, I've got to study sociology. I know I'm a proud sociologist. To get that somehow back. And I think having our older communities and elders we respect, that we can somehow tie all that in. So I'm hopeful, Malcolm. Yeah, so thank you.
Can I just respond to that? I mean, one of the big debates in the UK is this issue about lifting of the compulsory retirement age. And there is a very interesting discussion that I guess is going on, you know, all around other countries too, where if people do stay in a sort of well-paid professorial position into their 70s and 80s, is that blocking the opportunities for people at earlier career stages in that discipline and in that institution? And it's a very sensitive issue, and lots of different kind of points of view on it. But certainly some of the people that I spoke to who had retired gave that as part of a rationale for retiring, that they wanted to make way for the next generation and recognize that that retiring didn't mean stopping making a contribution. It just meant stopping being paid. But there's lots of opportunities to continue to make a contribution in retirement.
Thanks, Graham. We might go to Malcolm Alexander, who was on screen. So Malcolm, go ahead.
Look, I'd first like to thank both Fran and Graham for bringing up so much really interesting material and commenting a little bit about both the overlap and for some of the gaps in what they're presenting. I think listening to Graham, it's very clear that I'd probably sit in the cohort of people that he's looking at who have retired recently. Well, it was 10 years ago now, but it still seems quite recent. But in that sense, remain somewhat engaged in academic work, although not specifically in sociology. But on the other hand, listening to Fran talk about the public sociology of those people who were my teachers and mentors in the 1970s and 80s was just fantastic to hear. But it also makes me recognize that public sociology faded away and somehow in the generation of which I'm part. And Graham's question, I think, posed but not really addressed in your response a bit about what is a legacy that the current generation, that is the generation after the ones that Fran's told us about all those wonderful interventions and public sociology they did. My generation hasn't got that much that seems to have been left in such a way. And I guess I can leave it to Fran because it's the same generation. But I'd just like to hear some more comments perhaps about that connection, about there was a question raised with Fran earlier, what happened after the 1990s? The one example I know is multiculturalism. And the interesting thing then was the fantastic achievements that were put in place by the Hawke government about 1986 were written in with the Sunset Clause, I beg your pardon, so that when John Howard came to power in 1996, he didn't have to say, we don't believe in multiculturalism anymore. He just had to say, we're not going to bother to renew that stuff that the Hawke government brought in. So, I mean, just where that left us a bit stranded. So I'll leave it open to both of you. Graham looked at the same generation, looked at my generation. What have we left? Fran, you're part of it, and you know, where did we go? Where did we get sort of pushed aside?
If I can respond there. So yes, but it's not a complete drop-off after that period of public sociology. What became really difficult was the relations with government. So sociologists, the amount of sociology being done with government directly did shift. But I think what we'll also find from the data is that gradually the community sector was building up much stronger, perhaps in part as a reaction to all this. But so we get public sociology that's being done with other kinds of organizations. So if you compare, you know, two big periods, say the 50s and 60s with the 90s, you see sociologists working in the community in a way that they didn't back as much back then, simply because those community organizations didn't exist in the earlier period. So that the possibilities weren't there earlier on. So we get a shift in where that public sociology is being done and how it's being done, rather than a lack of it. If you, yeah.
Excellent point. Thank you.
And my response to that is a fascinating question, and I'm sort of grappling with it in many ways. So just a couple of points really. One is that the UK sociologist John Scott has recently written a book about the history of British sociology, and he says in that it's really important for each generation to have some awareness of the history of the discipline. And so he's produced a book there. And I know, Fran, you're working on the history of sociology in different countries, and it's important to have that. And then the second point is that these things do, when you said, Fran, that it's difficult to know exactly what kind of impact a piece of work is going to have. You can never quite tell who's going to take it up and where it's going to go. I've been struck by how some sort of apparently long forgotten pieces of research from the period that you're talking about, but in the UK, have been sort of rediscovered and restudied. But that's a much easier process if the materials from these original studies, not just the publications, but also the other kind of research paraphernalia, the interview schedules and those sorts of things, if they are archived. So I guess another important lesson about all these discussions is, if people are in later career or retirement and have all sorts of documents in relation to projects that were done in the past, it's really important that those things aren't thrown away or put on a bonfire or whatever, but are kind of made available for archivists, so that in the future people can go back to them and also maybe do a kind of then and now restudy using these resources. So that's a little plea for archival work, which I know better for the UK, where the UK Data Archive has played a really important role in preserving and making possible some sort of reflections on how things have changed and things have stayed the same between when these original pieces of pioneering research were done and now.
Thank you, Malcolm, for that wonderful question. I'd like to move on now to David Rowe, and then we've got Eileen Clark and Helen Marshall, and I'd imagine that probably would be it, but we can always continue the conversation via email. So, David.
Thanks, Roger. Hello, Graham and Fran.
Hi.
Great to see you.
Hello.
Sorry if I've been trying to. I'm in a hotel room in Bath in the UK, and I'm either illuminated like a Christmas tree or plunged into darkness. So I've been playing with visual settings, and it's been a long time since University of Essex Sociology Department, Graham, in the 1970s. Yeah, but,
40 years, 40 plus years. Yes.
You're wearing well.
Thank you.
Anyway. I just got a question. I wondered whether I didn't quite catch it. Sorry, I was a little bit late. Had some technical problems. Whether people talked about self-exploitation at all. So I've had two quite contrasting responses when I told someone that I like other academics, I don't tend to entertain the word retirement. I think of myself as a functioning academic who has given up his salary, kind of thing. And one person who I must say was a dedicated unionist said to me, "Oh God, you're not going to be one of those academics who does all that work for nothing." Like, so there's that side of being an emeritus professor. And I've just been at a big international conference in Paris, and I was talking to a woman in her, I guess, a mid-career academic from Australia, and she said to me, "I want your life." This sounds just right. So there's kind of there's a kind of romanticization of the life at one level, and on the other, a sense that you're a poor, sad, self-exploiting person. So I just wondered, either of you can respond to that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, my initial thought is that I didn't have a great deal of people talking about self-exploitation, but I guess that kind of relates to who people think that they're doing ongoing work for, especially if it's unpaid. And I guess my sense is that people don't feel they're doing it for their institutions, for their universities. I mean, universities are important in providing the infrastructure for library access and email and maybe kind of, a shared office and that sort of thing. But my sense is that people who carry on after stopping being paid with academic work are doing it for a kind of more abstract notion of, the wider academic community rather than their institutions. So I think people could still be committed to their discipline, but be quite critical of their institutions and sort of say, I'm glad I'm out of that institution and I don't have to do all this kind of audit culture type stuff, but I'm really glad still to be part of this wider network. So I guess you can frame it in a way that's not self-exploitative, but I think there is a concern about, if people do things for free, then that may be reducing the opportunities for the next generations. And I think there is an awareness of that.
Thank you, Fran. Unless you have anything quick to say, Fran, I might jump on to the next question.
Yeah, yes, fine. Go to the next
Okay.
question.
And sorry, Eileen, I want to butt in. I did promise Messina that she would be able to ask a question. So Messina, by all means, ask your question.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your presentations. Sorry, I'm on an iPhone and I'm in Moree, New South Wales, so I can't get my camera to work on my phone. But I couldn't help thinking of the history, Fran, that you gave in such a condensed manner. That were it not, I reckon, were it not for Jeannie Martin and Zubritsky, we may well not have had a multicultural policy in this country. But my question is, it seems that sociology now is a dirty word. It's come into play now on the American scene with critical race theory becoming somehow subversive, but why shouldn't it be if it is? I'm finding, and I'd just like your comments on this, on both of you, that public sociology is being turned into the social sciences as a catch-all phrase for almost like a safety network, as decisions were made in Australia to defund so much of the humanities. Would you like to comment on that, please? Both Fran and Graham.
Well, I have a much more optimistic view of sociology. I think there's always been difficulties in Australia with identifying as a sociologist and so on, but I think despite all the odds and all the difficulties, we have managed to sustain our student numbers over time. We're still getting a good cohort of students who are provided with sociological insights and education in Australia. And I always think too that Australia's borders are so permeable that Australian sociology has never survived as a kind of independent entity. It's always been part of a worldwide sociological enterprise. And we need to always remind ourselves of that. Sociology in Australia won't die because it is interconnected with sociology worldwide, and it's continually fed by it and feeds into it. So I'm much more positive about it. And yeah, I am just much more positive about its future. Of course, we have to continue to work, trying to put ourselves forward and let people know about sociology, but that's been ongoing throughout the past, and it's just not going to change. It's just something we just have to keep working at.
Thank you.
And I just throw in there again, I guess this will kind of repeat what I said earlier about the importance of history. I'm just thinking that, you know, those periods in UK sociology's history, thinking about the 1980s when the discipline was very much under attack in the way you're kind of describing. What's interesting in looking at that history is the response of sociologists and the defenses of and sort of justifications of doing sociology that were remarkably successful, given that the government of the day in the UK was very hostile to sociology in particular, other social sciences as well. But the discipline, through the activities of various groups and key individuals, was able to kind of weather that storm and come through in the way that you're describing, Fran, too. So I think if we have dark moments, then we can look back at history and learn lessons about the kinds of arguments that can be successful in kind of countering those critiques.
Yeah, thank you.
And they have to do very much with kind of what you're talking about with public sociology. In the UK, the language is very much about sort of research having impact, having real world impact, and that's important to be able to show that.
Excellent, thank you. Excellent. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Eileen Clark, thanks for your patience.
Thank you to Fran and to Graham, both excellent talks. I've just got a couple of quick points I'd like Graham to think about. I wonder, in your people that you, particularly the ones you interviewed, whether any of them were in the situation that several of my colleagues, indeed myself, have been in at times. We may be sort of in our late 50s, 60s, vaguely thinking about retirement, and find that our university is restructuring or downsizing. And all of a sudden it's a case of either you go or this young academic who's just bought a house and has got 2 kids at school, they've got to go. And so in a sense, the older person falls on their sword in the hope of preserving their colleague. The other point, I just wonder whether there was a lot of difference between the men and the women in your overall approach to retirement, given that many women have much less of a retirement income because of their interrupted careers and all that we know about women's pay compared to men's pay. Were women perhaps less willing or less able to retire because they didn't have much money? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. Yes, on the restructuring, I certainly did hear some fairly grim examples of people. In fact, I was interviewing during COVID, and some universities were taking that opportunity of COVID to undertake some restructuring and putting people under enormous pressure by saying, here is a redundancy deal for people to take, but you have to make up your mind within, I think it was 2 weeks was the one example. I was speaking to a dean and he was talking about his university at that time. So there are those pressures. I mentioned that in the UK, some universities, Oxford, Cambridge, among them, do still have a compulsory retirement age. And the justification for that is that if people retire in their late 60s, then that can, at a high salary, then that can open up opportunities to hire maybe 2 people earlier career, and also to diversify the university staff profile. And one person did take the University of Oxford to court over this, and I think they won because they said that there was no evidence that the University of Oxford was making people retire and then diversifying their employment base, or indeed hiring anybody at all. So I think there were lots of kind of really, there were instances of that kind of pressure that were mentioned there. And in relation to gender, I was basing my study in part on what had been done, a project that had been done by Barbara Tizard 20 plus years ago. And I was able to use many of her questions from that survey. And she very much emphasized the importance of gender in her findings. So I was really looking for that in my results, but didn't find it a strong point. In the survey material, there didn't seem to be a strong kind of gender profile to the answers. But it did come up in the interviews, and certainly your point about the kind of interrupted careers and the poorer sort of position in terms of salary levels and prospective pensions levels, that did get mentioned. But I fear that because I was using a sort of snowball sampling, I fear that I got a very kind of skewed sample of interviewees and of people who were, able to tell more kind of positive narratives about their retirement than those who were perhaps facing difficulties. But yes, I did look for gender and didn't find that. I did think that there's a very nice piece by Ali Hochschild where she talks about the importance of women academics and minority ethnic academics having role models to make their way in the world of academia. And so I was expecting that some people would come up with role models who had made their way as women. And Fran, you've told me about this book about sorry, I've forgotten her name, the person you mentioned who was the first woman professor of sociology.
Jean Martin?
Yes. So I've ordered that book and I'm looking forward to reading that, because I guess she is in some ways like a role model for women to make their way in what can be a very male-dominated environment.
Thank you, Ram.
Thank you, Eileen. Next, we have Helen Marshall, and then, at the moment, Naomi Green is the final question. So thanks, Helen.
Thanks for a really interesting talk, Graham and Fran. Fran, this is more related to your material, I think. I'm wondering if you picked up anything over time as sociology became less firmly linked to government, that it had to do with shifts in method. You spoke about the importance of sociology as collecting quantitative data at a period where large surveys were not common. As qualitative data sets became more common and as qualitative methods evolved, do you think there's any falling off in the willingness of government to link to sociology on the grounds that if you can't count it, it doesn't count?
Possibly. I haven't looked at that specifically myself, but my gut feeling would be that yes, you're quite right. There's that shift, and particularly with neoliberalism. So what you would get would be people who can do that kind of work now being in research centres and think tanks rather than being teaching research academics. So I'm thinking of people like Mark Weston and his big unit up in Queensland that does all those huge surveys and quantitative analyses for government at all levels. And then there's the research centres in Adelaide, for example, work and labour studies, research centres and so on. So that would be the shift. So it's coming out of the teaching research type academic and going more into those research centres. You've got lots of different factors that would have to be taken into account here, lots of different kinds of changes that are occurring that would reshape that kind of public sociology and who's actually doing it. Yes.
If I could just chip in there, I mean, there is a famous study from UK sociology in the 1980s by someone called Ray Powell, who did a mixed method project on sort of social polarization, including a 1 in 9 survey, household survey, but also some qualitative in-depth interviews and case studies. And he went to speak to the Cabinet Office in government structure, very much thinking that they'd be interested in his statistics. And actually they were most interested in and wanted to engage with the particular individual case studies. So I can send you the reference. If you email me, I can send you that reference if you're interested in that one case. But that kind of came at a pivotal time for sociology and really gave heart to qualitative sociologists to carry on with their work, because it could be taken up by at least some in government.
Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Graham and Fran. It's 15 or 17 minutes past the hour. We've got Naomi. Do you mind, Graham and Fran, hanging around for another 5 to 10 minutes?
That's fine.
No, it's fine.
Okay, then in that case, we might then finish off with Alonso. Okay, so by all means, go ahead, Naomi.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to come and listen to both of you today, Fran. I'm not sure if you remember me from doing some PhD supervision for me 20 years ago. It was a long time ago. And I guess just having listened to you today, you know, I'd just like to kind of say, Fran, that you've been a great role model for myself as somebody a little younger, not that much, just around your rigour and the graciousness and the way that you've, you know, really made a mark in the space yourself. I guess my comments around being, I'm not an academic. I work in the government sector and I've done that for about 20 years. And over time, what I've seen is this kind of increased specialisation in the space of research and methodology and things like that, where the clinical has become gold. And so what I've seen over that time is that the sociological has had that decrease in relevance and value, at least from the perspective of those with you know, undertaking research and doing funding. And that's been a big shame for me, coming from the place that I've come from in terms of my, you know, my education. So it does raise questions for people in my generation in terms of the future for us as sociologists, given that there does seem to be less interest or less capacity to move into that academic field because there's not a whole lot of opportunity there. There's less interest also in government in taking people that don't have that kind of specialised clinical qualification, and that really that's only leaving that community space. I guess the only thing that the only comment I'd make though is that what I've seen recently with COVID in the last 2 years is that in the mad scramble to get as many people on board as possible, all of a sudden we have relevance again. And that's been really heartening for me, although problematic in the way that it's come about. But in the fact that there aren't enough kind of specialists, there seems to be a much more inclusion of kind of that generalist capacity, particularly that comes from that sociological perspective. So I guess they were just my comments. I'm not sure if either of you have anything to comment on that.
Can you give us a little bit more information? You keep saying clinical. What do you mean? What space are you in?
So I work in government in disability, mental health space. And particularly in that area, it's if you have qualifications in or a background in psychology or a background in, you know, one of the therapies, that is considered as, you know, a place of value. Whereas those of us that come from a discipline that has broader applicability doesn't seem to have that same value.
I'm not sure that I can really add anything to that comment. It's been an ongoing battle for a long time. I'm not sure that I can add anything new to that from the data. I'm sorry.
Perhaps I could just throw in, I mean, I was kind of looking at career trajectories and looking at obituaries and so on, and biographies and autobiographies. And something that comes up so much in people reflecting about their careers is this notion of serendipity, this kind of like chance encounter or chance sort of opportunity, and the preparedness and, you know, the skill in sort of spotting those opportunities. So I guess, again, if we look at the history of disciplines, then we see just lots of ways in which things take new turns, hinging on apparently quite serendipitous kind of circumstances. So I was doing a session last week talking to early career researchers and about career planning, and I said, you know, well, don't just leave things to be blown in whichever direction by the wind, but do kind of bear in mind that many people's careers have taken new turns, new directions, on the basis of quite a serendipitous encounter or a serendipitous kind of situation emerging. So look out for those opportunities. So I guess it's another plea for just putting things into historical context and recognizing that things move in not always predictable ways.
Thank you, Naomi. And thank you for that comment, Graham. I think this will be the last question. So, Alonso, I think you're trying to reposition yourself, but certainly go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry, I was in
an
office with my housemate, in a house office, and it's difficult for both of us to speak at the same time. Thank you very much, both of you, for your presentations. I am very interested in both topics. And in particular, my question has to do with what Fran presented. I think one of the elements that jumped to my sight was that you discussed these figures, these sociologists, as public intellectuals. And that's one of the big elements that was left like implicit. So I was wondering whether, taking into consideration the change in the media, in the sorts of professions that people engage with in order to do public sociology, I wonder whether there's still room for that aspect of becoming a public intellectual, or of having sociologists as public intellectuals in Australia and maybe in the UK as well. And as a foreigner, if you have some examples, that would come in handy. Thank you so much.
I can answer to that. I can address that question. Certainly, I don't see that there's been any slowdown in the amount of public sociology that's being done in Australia, but that it's being done in different ways, and it has somewhat different audiences to what it used to have. But sociology is being done not just from sociology departments, but it's being done in all kinds of ways across Australia. And one of the things I'm really keen to show with my study is that the sociologists in sociology departments is the tiniest piece of sociology. Sociology is being done in so many different ways in the public sector, in the private sector, in the third sector. And the amount of public sociology is huge. And I don't think there's any slowdown in the amount, in the possibilities for public intellectuals either. But we might be seeing that happening in different ways than the way it used to. We've got social media today, which is so incredibly important. And so that alone is making a real difference to how a public intellectual becomes a public intellectual, and also how they do their work and who their audience is.
And can I just throw in there, I guess you'll have heard of the great public intellectual Zygmunt Bauman, who retired and then became like a household name and was an important influence in all sorts of contexts. But in answer to your question about how do you become a public intellectual, how do you practice public sociology, Bauman gave some terrible advice to one of his PhD students, which was never to network, because if you're any good, people will come to you. And I just think that's terrible advice, especially, as you say, in the age of social media and so on. So I think don't be afraid to network. It would be what I would draw from that particular example. That the days of if you're any good, people coming to you are probably long gone.
Yes, and just maybe to add, if you look in the chats with Andrew Jakubowicz's comments there, he's talking about some of these pamphlets from Elkin are now occurring in blogs, and that really, thank you, Andrew, that really illustrates my point. It's being done in different ways today, but that doesn't mean there's less of it, and it doesn't mean it's having less impact. How you measure the intensity of that, I don't know, but it's certainly occurring in new and different ways.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to thank all the questions from the audience, and finally to thank very much Graham for getting up early, and for Fran. I'm not sure, I think it's a bit late for you, Fran, but thank you so much, both of you. This discussion, in a sense, grew out of the retired cohort of the TASA, and I think that there used to be about 39 or so, maybe, but I noticed a few more people retired of the retired cohort on tonight's webinar. So thank you to everybody, and we hopefully will be able to continue some of these questions, and certainly I think Graham's the questioning of the audit culture, because we all love sociology, but we all hate the audit culture. Well, let's hope we do. So thank you, everybody, and good night, good morning, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.